Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Fischman. I'm the Ruth Gordon Shapiro Director of the Davis Museum at Wellesley College. It's wonderful to see everybody here today. This, as you may know, is the culmination of a very long and winding road. Several years ago, let's say between 4 and 5, I went to meet with the Mellon Foundation with Mariette Westerman, who proposed that we concoct something to do here that we couldn't do otherwise. And we kind of put our heads together, the art department and the Davis Museum, and came up with a project. Wouldn't it be great to hire someone to think about new media in ways that connected museum practice to pedagogy, art history to technology, and sort of studio making? And they bit, and we ended up with a 3-year program, and Mike Meisels came to join us and began in his position with a seminar intended for faculty. It brought Patrick here for the first time. We had an amazing moment where I think a kind of convergence of energy happened, lots of interest across disciplines, across campus, and it made us realize what might be possible in terms of working in the museum, curating, teaching, engaging students, engaging faculty, and thinking about kind of new forms of making in terms of technology. And as we thought about that, Mike proposed an exhibition of Jason's games. Really extraordinary opportunity to be introduced to such brilliant and thoughtful and elegant work. I feel like I've been very lucky in that. So thank you, Mike, and congratulations on what has proven to be an exceptionally beautiful exhibition. I think that the interest in this exhibition has been pretty tremendous and amazing. And so what we imagined is that we would bring together scholars and thinkers and makers of all sorts to spend a day together talking about games and play and taking seriously the ways that that kind of making can function in a museum and function in other contexts. I mean, one of the sort of interesting moments when we were developing this project was to try to figure out how to see connections between a museum experience, which is both intimate and public, personal, private, and communal, and gaming. To think about the ways that we might not just sort of drop video games into the museum and enhance their sort of, let's say, cultural standing with the imprimatur of the museum, but to really make some kind of difference, to create a different kind of space or a platform to think about how they function and how they might function in a museum. Anyway, I think that is at least in part the topic for today. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks to Liz Gardner for all of her work to make this happen. I hope it's a wonderful day. I look forward to it together.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll head over to Colin's segment now to get started. So the first panel is going to focus on visual design with our colleague up from New York, Mitu, and a visiting lecturer from Skype from England, and moderated by Dave Olson. And there will be a solid break between panels 2 and 3 for you all to come back and explore that exhibition as well. So I'll see you guys across the hall in a second. Maybe I'll go lead. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let me welcome you all again. So I'm Mike Meisels, the curator of the exhibition, and right now I just want to quickly introduce our first panel. It's going to be moderated by Dave Olson, who's a faculty member here at Wellesley College. I'm joined on my on my left by Mitu Khandaker-Kokoris, who I think I did finally get that correct.
Yeah.
Close enough anyway. Who's a new professor at NYU in the Game Center, as well as by Leigh Alexander, who is an independent game writer based in the UK and comes it's with strong insistence from Jason Rohrer that she participate. So with that introduction, I am going to be sitting here, sort of running her slide, so you can pay attention to the nice, friendly, floating face at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So Leigh, just go ahead and get started and tell me when you would like to advance the slide.
Sure, I can do that. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Apologize if the connection is not great. Thank you very much for having me. I am a technology culture writer, and I'm an author and a consultant in both video games and wider media landscape. But I spent much of my career to date as a video game critic, during which time I studied Jason Rohrer's work pretty closely, and we enjoyed a lot of very interesting and memorable design conversations. So it's kind of a cool honor to be asked here virtually to speak about his work. Although I admit to having a bit of trouble with the brief, which asked me and my wonderful colleague Mitu to talk about the visuals of Jason's games. And Mitu and some of the other designers here might plan to touch on this themselves, so I won't belabor it. But one thing I want to start off noting is that I think it's important to look at a game, particularly in a situation like this where you have a suite of games that are all basically made by the same one person with clear established individual authorship over each. It's a holistic thing, and it's difficult to talk about individual elements in isolation, but I will try. Yeah, I think it's good to look at it as a sort of experience where any given element either serves another one or results directly from it. So it's not really like a piece of purely visual art where statements are necessarily going to be made primarily through aesthetic choices, but a medium where every act on the part of the designer seems to come through, seems to conspire to create the ecosystem. Although I will probably stray a little bit from talking just about the appearance or aesthetics of the games. I hope I don't step on anybody else's feet. But I do think that Jason's works are very visually distinct. So we can have the next slide, please.
Yeah, and Leigh, you're just cutting out a little bit, so I'm just going to temporarily turn off the video because the audience, I promise you, will pay rapt attention, but just to encourage.
And there's no need to see my face.
I'll even leave your face up, but I'm just going to turn off the live feed of the still audience paying rapt attention to the presentation.
Sure. And if you do need me to repeat something, or if I cut out completely, please feel free to holler.
Yeah, and that sounds much better already.
Sorry?
That sounds much better already.
Awesome, I'm so glad. So looking at Passage, which was and I think many people's first, it's not his first game, but my first introduction to Jason's designs, visually we notice a couple of things about it. I think the slide that I picked shows 3 different images of the game. The game is much longer than it is tall, and I'm afraid I don't know the exact resolution, but even in 2008 it was very small on the screen. And it also has these incredibly simple and these coarse, tactile-looking pixel graphics. So Passage is a game where you, as the player, explore this very narrow space. You can go from left to right to a certain extent, and you can go down to a certain extent. And there are some traditional video game-style chests to open and some scenery, and that's it. And you're likely to encounter a partner, and she and you will grow old and die with each step you take. And it's a really dark game, like it's on the inevitability of death. You basically just walk until you die, and you decide if you want to look around the world some more, but in the limited time you have, or try to open chests and figure out what is inside them. So it's on the inevitability of death and perhaps the fleeting value of companionship. But strangely, these heavy, dark themes are contrasted with this sort of charming and familiar, almost what we would call, and what we were calling at the time, a retro video game aesthetic, pixels and chests. And this, I think, traditional video gamey language of Passage helps deliver the emotional landscape. It triggers the appetite to explore and to gain stuff and to win, which then works in very direct odds with the core experience of aging alongside a partner, which is not a video gamey thing. And furthermore, the physical and very narrow orientation of the game window itself, I think, helps create this sense of limitation and of claustrophobia. I don't think you can see it on the slide, but when you play the game, the edges of the playing field sort of have this tempting blur that you want to peer outside of your very narrow frame of vision. You want to resolve that information, despite the fact that you know every step you take to answer those questions about infinity are killing you. So what I still love so much about this one is the fact that it is a game, and it uses the language and the spatial constraints of games and the appetites that games tend to trigger in players, particularly those of us who are well acquainted with that existing vocabulary. Passage couldn't have been an essay or a poem or a visual installation or anything like that. And I think that's actually something that unites all of Jason's work. these days we can and do make all kinds of art with games, but it's harder, I think, to make art that could only be expressed as a game. Next slide, please. It should be gravitation, right? Yeah?
Gravitation.
Yeah. It's another one I like. Similar to Passage in that it sort of leverages this pixelated look, like these kind of almost Mario-looking levels. And I'm giving a lot of credit for the quote-unquote aesthetic impact of these graphics, but I think at the time that these games were made, it was at least in part a happy accident or a byproduct of the tools that were available to a one-man shop making games in 2008. So like, oh, you know, this retro pastiche, this, you know, primitive tactility, I think some of it is probably out of necessity and a result of the tools and the budget that was available at the time. You know, these days we have a lot of ways for people to make very simple games for free or for cheap, but there were way, way, way more constraints on an individual creator at the time when Jason started gaining recognition within the culture. So again, with Gravitation, there's this fascinating contrast between the cute graphics and the theme, like Passages to me about questioning the purpose of our desires in the face of inevitable death. And Gravitation, I think, can be interpreted as being about creative tension. I think I found a quote with Jason himself saying that it's kind of about creative mania. And in the game, you're managing these opposing forces. You're either being literally dragged down or sort of flying too close to the sun. And at the time it came out, I had a colleague who had bipolar disorder who told me that Gravitation felt like an analog for him. For the tension inherent in being alive. And I think that's an extremely, again, heavy and complicated thought space to illustrate with this sweet and minimalist art. Next slide, please. If it sounds like I'm being vaunted or overgenerous about these dark themes, I will skip ahead in the time in the oeuvre a bit to Sleep is Death, which Jason made to allow people to design video game stories for a partner to play. I think the idea was really ahead of its time, and I don't know if really the online infrastructure that it needed was there at the time when he released it, but it was sort of like a closed two-person Minecraft, where you could build almost anything for a partner, and you could rewire it on the fly in response to what they did. But instead of calling it something like Story Builder, or like Jason called it Sleep is Death, which maybe continues along the point I'm making about, I think, all of his ideas being profoundly, profoundly dark. I played this game with Jason for an article that I wrote in Kotaku at the time. It was like 2011 maybe. And he crafted a scenario just for me. And it was just about all these people dying in an operating room. I'm not sure, like just people, like, you know, I start in the house and the phone is ringing and I'm like, oh cool, and it's just, I end up in an operating room and one after the other people are dying in front of me. And I'm not sure, to this day, I don't know whether there was an affordance built in for me to intervene in these deaths, but no matter what I did, he just kept having all these sprites die on the operating table. And it's somehow creepier and more touching with these nostalgic and these primitive graphics. And we're laughing about it now, but about 6 years ago when we did this, I recall feeling, you know, profoundly moved and very haunted. Like the minimalism of these visuals enhanced the experience. I think at the time he explained, obviously he can explain it himself, but I think at the time he explained that what he was looking for was a solution to the idea of imperfect artificial intelligence. Like, what if I could just be the what if he could just be the artificial intelligence rather than having to code the artificial intelligence? But I think what he wanted was for the player to have an even more adaptive and realistic experience of death. He did tell me at that point that he was planning to kill all of the characters in my story, but he saved one because of the insistence of my player behavior. The next slide, please. So far, I have spoken about games that mostly have people in them. Inside a Starfield Sky is a tactical shooter, is how it was described, and it's about infinity. And you can see that it has this also dark, even though there's no people, it has a sort of what I would call an anxious and a tactile aesthetic, even though the game is very abstract. So I think the tone of the work, his work, remains really unified throughout, even though his design goals and the problems that he's looking to solve by making these games have varied wildly over the course of his career. And I don't even have the time to touch on all of the games. So a lot of times with art, we want to know, like, what is the creator saying and what message are they sending? And with Jason Rohrer's games, I think that there are always two forces present, a practical issue or a design constraint that he wants to explore, to push, or to solve, and also a deep-seated life or death personal anxiety that he has. The former force is simple, and the second is broad and deep, and I think when you look at the visuals of his games, which are small windows, graphical simplicity, a lot of visual constraint, on top of these very sophisticated emotional spaces, you can see the contrast in play. Next slide, please. I'm only going to speak really quick about the castle doctrine, which is, I understand, I was told it's not a part of this exhibit, I guess. It's probably because it's like a libertarian home defense fantasy. I guess like yeah. No, I mean, I felt sort of, I guess the word is wounded when this game came out, because it is the darkest and coldest looking Jason Rohrer game. To me, it felt like a subversion of the person I knew, or that I felt that I knew. You know, critics often fantasize that we know people because we know their work well, and obviously that's a lot of projection. But this game is so dark and cold looking, both visually and thematically. You play the patriarch of a white nuclear family, and you're setting up traps and things against other players who might want to rob you. And I think a lot of people worried that it was advancing these conservative ideals, like stand your ground laws or gender norms or that stuff. But when I talked to Jason about this game, I mean, I decided to, I felt a sense of belief that he's not a person who believes in gender norms or stand your ground laws. I know that this game is what sort of was born from him after his family was attacked by dogs, I think, and he told me that he designed this as a method of expressing the resulting anxiety, what role he was expected to play as a protector in the template that America gives us. And I, as a critic, felt that this game was his way of presenting and considering the fear and the pressure that he felt to conform to this armed American hetero-patriarchal, frame. And I think some people might have thought that he was trying to celebrate these sort of broken ideals, but I mean, as a critic, I chose not to read it that way, and that's in part because of what the game looks like. Again, it's a dark and a sad-looking game. And notably, I think Jason told me it was the first video game that he ever made in, like, however many years that has blood in it, which felt considered to me. So I think in that regard, the Castle Doctrine is not that different from the rest of his games. It wants you to reflect on unpleasant systems. It's about a dark aspect of being alive in human society. I'd like to believe that he's the last guy in the world who would like force his family into gender roles or want to build giant electric walls around stuff, or who would like underwrite actual structural harm to people. But I mean, I guess you'd have to ask him directly about his politics. I'm probably projecting a lot. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, it's the vanity of a critic that we know the creator well and can speak on their behalf. But I really think, so there's this contrast that we see that when we look at a Jason Rohrer game. We have these bright and logical and accessible visuals, familiar visuals, layered over some genuinely gut-wrenching, inconclusive, major philosophical prompts. I think that contrast exists when you meet him as a person as well. He makes what most people consider to be these incredibly intellectual and enigmatic games that are about these dark and frightening things, but I know him as an incredibly warm and affable person, very accessible, very easy to talk to, quite pragmatic and funny, and full of enthusiasm. And he's always, like, when you talk to him, he almost never stops smiling, and it's kind of hard to reconcile that with the idea of someone who thinks about death as much as he clearly does. So when Jason was coming up, and Jason's trajectory coming up as an independent game designer, it sort of parallels my own coming up as a critic, so obviously I feel very personal toward his work. He was among the first game makers in my career lifetime to be celebrated for this sort of highly individualized work. And the idea of a game that could withstand artistic scrutiny was I think, pretty relatively new to mainstream audiences at the time and to mainstream fans of games. There was a big fear among my readers at the time that this sort of work was pretentious, or that it was aspiring to apply purpose to games that they were not made to serve. But seriously, all you have to do at least to dispel this notion of pretense is to talk to him about his work. Like, you could try to, inside the actor's studio, him about one of his aesthetic decisions, and he just kind of laughs and goes, well, that was the only way I could make the game work. And I think his games are a lot like he is, humble and approachable and familiar, and they still leave you with a lot to think about. And there are only, I think, a handful of individual designers in games who have such a cohesive body of work where there's like a career progression across these various topics, but generally united by theme and aesthetic choices. So I think Jason's games are a treasure to the form, and I'm glad they're being honored here in this way. That's all I prepared. I hope it was interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be back with some discussion momentarily.
Cool, I'll hang in there. Thank you.
All right, awesome.
Okay, so am I taking?
Yep. Take this guy.
Cool. Let me just put it back in. Hopefully I've got enough power to do it this way. Okay. All right. So let me just check this one.
There we go. Flashing. There you go.
Cool. Okay. So hi everyone. My name is Mitu Khandaker-Kokoris. I'm a game developer and I'm a professor at the NYU Game Center. And I had the pleasure of doing a bit of a deep dive into gravitation last year as part of the Well Played series at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York, which is the first time I guess I really had a longer conversation with Jason and got to know him. So here, obviously I've been invited to talk about the visual design of his game. So that's kind of what I'm going to do today. And that's not really so much how the games look in and of themselves, but really how their look contributes to what the games have to say and how they communicate to the player. So this actually is a sprite sheet from Passage. So a sprite sheet, for those of you who don't know, is a collection of images that are used in a game, and they're sort of presented in this way, rather than sort of individual images, because it saves disk space, it saves computational power in having to load up individual images, and also because you can sort of recombine them in different ways, right, in your game. So anyway, I'll come back to that idea a bit later. Going back to some of the history of Jason's games, so these are screenshots from his first two games, Transcend on the left there, which was this sort of abstract 2D, very sort of visually interesting shooter, and on the right is Cultivation, which is actually a sort of social simulation game. So it's a game in which you manage this garden, and there's sort of conflicts over planting and territory and things like that. So there's no combat, but it's really about managing the sort of needs of these little agents. And you know, really the idea that the things that you do can impact those around you, which I think is a really fascinating concept, especially because social simulation is kind of my own specific area of interest when it comes to games to a large extent. So on the left there is a screenshot of the new upcoming version of my game Redshirt. There's an existing version from a couple of years ago which looks different, but the art and everything has been redone. And on the right there is my current game that I'm working on called Invasion Stories, and those are both social simulation games to various extents. Unfortunately, of course, I'm not here to talk to you about social simulation mechanics, although I would love to have a talk with Jason at some point about that, because that's just a point of overlap, I think, that we have in our design interests. I'm going to go forward in time from those games, though, and talk about Passage. I know Leigh's talked about Passage to some detail, so I'll try not to retread the same ground too much. And I know that Jason may or may not get a little annoyed at how Passage is often talked about disproportionately sometimes, or at least it has been in the past, given his sort of large repertoire of other really interesting work that he's produced. But I think it's a really important example to consider, and it was certainly really important to me personally, which I'll come back to.
So we've talked a little bit, I guess, already about how Passage works. I hope you've all got to play it in the exhibition. So it's this game in which you're essentially this little avatar moving to the right. Essentially a self-portrait of Jason. And if you choose to go on to the right, you'll meet the spouse, which is a depiction of Jason's wife. And from that moment on, you have no choice but to sort of, if you've joined with the spouse, you have no choice but to walk on together. Sort of the future looking sort of interesting and mysterious and exciting when you first begin playing, but then as you keep playing, it's sort of past which becomes a sort of interesting bit visually. So as you carry on together, you'll notice that despite the presentation of this narrow, like 100 by 16 pixel grid, you can in fact go down and collect these treasure chests, which may or may not contain stars, which we can consider to be these creative achievements or other kinds of personal life goals. And there are other chests that you can get to as well, or not, depending on whether or not you have the spouse with you and whether you can get through the gaps together or not. But the chests that you do collect together, the stars that you do collect together, are worth more points. But then, no matter what you do, inevitably the passage of time catches up with you, and then your spouse will die, and then you'll be debilitated, and then you know that you'll be waiting for death as well. It's a game whose meaning is best conveyed through play and replay. In fact, the very first time I played Passage, because of the way it's represented, I didn't realize that you could go down and collect these chests. I thought it was just a game about just moving to the right. And I didn't know I could seek out those prizes, those achievements. I will note, actually, just a quick note on the sort of iOS, the touchscreen version of the game, kind of probably makes it more apparent to you all the directions you can go in, because it has this on-screen virtual directional pad, right? So I think it'd be really interesting to see sort of how people on these touchscreen devices approach the game and how they understood the game first versus people who played it on PC or Mac. So there's the idea of iPhone users more likely to receive the immediate gratification of getting stars and prizes, which seems apt. Okay, so Leigh mentioned a little bit about how much game Passage and Jason's games like it spoke to a lot of people who played it, myself included. So my first encounter with Passage, and again for me it was the first of Jason's games that I played, coincided with a time in my life, sort of in my early to mid-20s, when I was starting to think more deeply and more seriously about games and how games mean, right? And also, on an even more personal note, I also encountered it during this big turning point in my life when I was that age, and I had to make this big decision about whether or not to break up from this like awful toxic relationship I was in with a boyfriend at the time, who I hadn't realized until I got out of it was kind of harming my personal goals and my career goals. And so I played it at a time when I had a lot of these sort of post-breakup feelings of uncertainty and what was going to happen to my life. And in fact, true story, I actually had this screenshot from the game printed out on my desk, stuck to my monitor at that time in my life, just to sort of remind myself of the path that I had chosen and what my mission in life was at that time. Yeah, and so this is obviously an example of the character getting a star in a place where they wouldn't have been able to if they had the partner, right? Passage had sort of provided me with this brilliant visual and contextual metaphor for my own personal experience. So again, I'll come back to Passage later, especially this idea of relating to its themes through its visual communication. So Passage can, of course, be very closely tied to gravitation, both visually and thematically. So in Gravitation, to the right there, we see adult Jason depicted, right? And it's the same sprite, and so this is the sprite sheet actually from Passage, seeing the sort of, where you can see the four different states of Jason at his different points in aging, and the father in Gravitation is adult Jason with the darker hair. And the child in the game is Jason's son Mez when he was very young. And I think Jason has said in his creator's statement about Gravitation that he tried to experiment with sort of doing sort of higher res pixel art to represent the characters in Gravitation instead, but he felt like that the abstracted version of himself was just more effective, right? That it sort of works the way that cartoons work by allowing us, the viewer, to fill in the gaps in that abstraction, right? In a way that Verisimilitude doesn't, right? I'm sure a lot of you have read Understanding Comics, which is always a go-to reference text for game designers. If you haven't, you should definitely read it.
It's downstairs in the exhibition.
Oh,
at Jason's request.
There we go. So we can see how Passage and Gravitation kind of embodied this very particular kind of art style. And again, in the creative statement for Gravitation, Jason went on to say, though I don't feel that low-res pixel art is my stylistic home, I can't imagine using any other rendition of myself for an autobiographical game. On the other hand, my life is not interesting enough to serve as fodder for many more autobiographical games. This is simply a comfortable harbor to dock at for a game or two. I will return to the sea sometime soon. And certainly he did return to the sea after that, moving distinctly away from the art style of Passage and Gravitation, and instead into these sort of glowing gradients and drop shadows in games like Primrose and inside a star-filled sky. Leading to this sort of overall different kind of look, sort of returning slightly to his roots of procedural generation, sort of set out during Transcend and Cultivation. So we can see how, as Jason mentioned, that specific art style of Passage and Gravitation were these sort of departures from some of his other subsequent works. But if we go back, in like games history to 2007, the time when they were released, there is a specific point about visual design and sort of more short-term games history that I'd like to explore. Because when Jason made and released Passage in 2007, it was also the same year that Rod Humble released The Marriage, which I don't know if any of you have explored The Marriage. It's a game in which the player sort of uses the mouse to shrink or expand the blue or pink squares representing Rod Humble and his wife respectively. And it's a game about Rod's marriage. It's a game about sustaining the conflicting needs of partners in a marriage. So there were these creators, and certainly these weren't the only examples, making games to express various types of human experiences. And they certainly gained visibility in doing so. Like there was a certain section of games blogging and talking about games, which really talked about these ideas that they were exploring, which was sort of significant in games history. Of course, many people had been making games and expressive games at that for many years before. There is certainly a lost historical narrative of the women who made indie games prior to that, for example. But the work of Jason was certainly important and visible, as was Rod Humble's The Marriage. But I think one of the issues is that through no particular fault of the creator's own, these works were kind of heralded as this kind of minimalist design, as if you're stripping away all the decoration, stripping away all the sort of shiny bits of polish and juiciness and all these other things that we talk about in games, and in doing so exposing something that is true and real. And maybe that's true to an extent, but we also can't help but notice amidst this that the games that gained this kind of visibility at that time, heralded as being part of that movement, were made by a certain type of creator, right? Namely, white, straight, cisgender men talking about heteronormative relationships. But of course there was definitely something to Passage, right? As I mentioned, it resonated with me personally with its themes of morality and hard choices. But it's important to realize that that particular implementation of it isn't necessarily part of some universal human truth. Some people may have struggles and conflicts which they're trying to resolve within their lifetimes, which are nothing to do with, like maybe they don't even have the opportunity to try and balance a relationship and creative ambition, for example. So I decided to do an experiment. I modded, without Jason's permission, Jason Rohrer's passage very quickly. It took me less than 10 minutes to do so because I wanted to see if I could represent another kind of struggle. In my modded version of the game, which I'll play for you in a second, I made the protagonist a woman, specifically a woman of color, and her potential romantic partner is also a woman. And there are no treasure chests to collect stars from. Instead, I've replaced the treasure chests with family members and friends from whom to collect love and acceptance, if they will offer it. But sometimes you can't get to their love and acceptance if you're with the partner. And it's still, so I will play the game for you now, just to show you an example. All right. Is there music? Yeah. There we go. All right. The sprite sheets and replace them. And here's a challenge for you. Think about how you would mod Passage. Think about your mortality. Which compromises that you might make scare you the most? And it's very easy to mod Passage in that way. All the sprite sheets are right there on the Windows and Mac versions. If you download the game, there's a folder called Graphics, and you'll see all of these files in there. And so on the left there is what the original looked like for the player character. On the right there is what it looked like for the modded version. So yeah, that's my challenge to you. How would you mod Passage? And I also wanted to say that it still works, right? It still works as this set of struggles, because the mechanical underpinnings that Jason has designed are elegantly one of limited time and conflicting goals. the visual design of the game contributes one story, but actually it can be so many different people's stories with lots of different kinds of conflicts. And again, yes, I would charge you to look at how you would mod Passage for the particular struggles in your life and what part of mortality you struggle with. So, thank you.
So I'm going to quickly take the visuals so we can see and hear Leigh.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah, and so this is the opportunity for you all to ask questions to the panelists about visual design or anything that they spoke about in their presentations. If none of you have particular questions, I've set up a few questions because I have my own questions about the visual design that goes along with it. But again, I want to open it up to everybody here to
And
ask.
Leigh, you can hear all of us, correct?
Sure can.
Awesome. Fantastic.
Well, if nobody has a question,
Oh,
there we go.
there we go.
I know that this panel is about the visual design, but I was wondering if you might say something about the music and how the music evokes the same kind of feelings that the visual design might be presenting, and also about kind of like the mortality theme of the music as well.
So Leigh, the question was about how the sound design of Jason's games complements the visual.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered your own question in that, you know, they very much rely on a similar set of principles, I think. I find a lot of the music that I can think of to be made with very simple sonic building blocks, and yet, you know, very vast and very sad, sort of like the visuals. So I think you're onto something when you say that they're influenced in a similar way.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. I think the use of music, I think, in Gravitation is particularly interesting as well. They kind of, the music changes depending on whether you're in that sort of like flight of mania versus not. And I think, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that Jason does really well is pair music with what's happening in the game.
I think there's a very interesting game too. The first one he makes, Transcend, has like almost a musical mechanic in it, where what you're doing is creating this visual collage, but that also is played out as like sort of spatial musical structure, where if you line these elements up horizontally, they create one kind of collage. If you align them up along a different axis, they create something happening in stereo. And the first time I went out to see Jason talk about his work, we wound up talking about, you know, experimental classical music from the 1960s for probably the first like third to half of our conversation. You know, thinking about ideas of recursion and procedural generation and those kinds of things, which a lot of interesting makers have been thinking about. And Jason took many of those ideas and did something interesting with them in game design, which is a very new spin on that kind of work.
I also wanted to mention that it's very easy to mod Passage by modifying the graphics. It's just as easy to mod the music because the musical score in Passage is represented as pixel art. So you can open up this pixel file in Photoshop and change the notes. So go to town.
There's a question.
Hi. This isn't necessarily a question. I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the way that you modded Passage because I think when I first saw it, I appreciated the mechanics of the game, but not necessarily. I didn't really connect with the story very well. But I think the way that you changed it was a lot more resonating with me. I think it was interesting that it uses the exact same mechanics, but it felt a lot different. So.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said already, I think the mechanical underpinnings of the game lends itself to being one about time running out and what are you going to do with that time, right? So I think you can put lots of different types of personal spin on it. So I'm glad that one resonated with you.
I will say too, when we were designing the exhibition, Jason said, "Oh, it would be great if we could just have all of these games in their totally native environment on Windows, so people can play around and mod them and change the pixel art." I said, "Oh yeah, that would be great, but we won't do that. We are going to control them so that they will present it reliably and comprehensible." There's a balance between the museums wrestle with in every kind of exhibition between let's call it stability and access. You know, you can see the sculpture and we'll put, you know, light sensitive materials out on view, but you can't like touch them or handle them. It's the exact same kind of balance that we had to strike when presenting Jason's work. You know, some things had to be changed because it wasn't really sort of technologically feasible to have them connected to the internet. So Jason, I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for you because you're standing in the room, but like would have wanted Passage moddable in the exhibition, and I, as the evil...
I wanted people to be able to poke around in the folder and see, like, with the games, like, I always try to ship my games with, you know, a lot of people, like, compress all their files into some sort of proprietary format, so the things are even, you can't even steal the graphics or whatever. And I like leaving, like, all that stuff hanging there, and all these, like, there's the music folder, and there's the sprite folder, and you can open up these sprite sheets, and a number of people, I mean, Mitu's not the only one, a lot of people have poked around in there, like, oh, whoa, look, this is how these tiles work? Like, I want people to be able to see, you know, that underpinning stuff, and I guess in part to make it modelable. But I wasn't hoping to make it, like, have a pixel editor in the museum. It was more that I wanted people to have that experience of poking through, like, whoa, this is how this works. That's kind of, because people don't normally people who don't make games don't understand how a sprite sheet works, and seeing it, like, oh, that's what makes all these tiles fit together is pretty informative.
I just have a follow-up question for the mod thing. So I have my students mod Passage all the time, and most commonly they'll do queer mods at kind of representational level. But because it's a very quick exercise, they'll oftentimes criticize themselves for merely making a kind of representational or visual intervention rather than a mechanical one. And I'm curious whether you've seen any interesting kind of mechanics-based mods that change the format of what it is that you're doing in the game, regardless of who you are.
Yeah, I haven't seen any mechanics-based mods of Passage, and yeah, I haven't seen any other mods necessarily. I would love to see what your students are doing with it, for sure. I think you know the sort of thing that I was trying to do with changing the idea of sort of like stars or, you know, creative achievements for something as simple as like love and acceptance. Like, I feel like that changes like the tone and it changes the flavor without necessarily changing like what's mechanically happening, right? And you know, so it's sort of beyond this representational layer almost. So maybe like encourage your students to think about what else they can do with the environment, which would give that sort of change of flavor as opposed to just representation.
I'll ask one quick question because, you know, there's a lot of assumptions about people's understanding of this visual language, and I want to ask the panelists and Jason, like, you know, these games were made in 2007, but yet they're so nostalgic of like the 80s. I'm just wondering, like, why this visual style exists, or is it, you know, and just because there's a lot of young people here who don't, you know, didn't like step into the video arcade and have like jumped right into this.
Yeah, it's definitely not a conscientious attempt to summon the 80s. I mean, obviously I can't speak for Jason's intention with his art, but the reason that you see a lot of pixel art being made around that time is simply because it is low spec, it is low cost, and someone can do it or they could at that time. So I think a lot of the simple graphics that you're seeing in the late 2000s simply result of design seconds. The aesthetic underpinnings of a work can be explained basically entirely by the tools that were used to create it. And, you know, I think the 2000 decade was when video games finally began to be something that it used to be needed a computer science degree and to be a member of a 300-person team to make a video game. And then, you know, later in the last decade, you know, suddenly there was an explosion of individual creatorship fueled by, you know, tools and mods and things that were accessible to individuals in new ways. So, I mean, again, like maybe Jason really was deliberately trying to conjure an 80s arcade. A lot of time, I think what you see as retro is just a product of what is easy to make at that time.
I think added to that, I think I agree entirely with that, but I think it's also a little bit, there are other added layers of complexity. I think sometimes it's like a useful, well, firstly, it's like a useful form of abstraction, and I think Jason has mentioned that in his creative statement for Gravitation. Like, you know, he made this like slightly higher res version of, you know, which had like fingers and stuff, right? And And it just didn't, and having that more abstracted type of character was just more useful because it allows the player to project themselves onto it to a greater degree than they would do otherwise. And I think also, let's not forget the the fact that people think that they should, let's not forget fashion in game aesthetics, right? Like the idea of people thinking that they should make games which look like that as well. Which certainly isn't, obviously not what Jason did because he explicitly wanted to abstract what was going on in the game. But yeah, so I think that's a lot of what you see a lot of games from around that time and even now, sort of going for that kind of look.
Any other questions or thoughts?
I'll jump in.
All right.
So I want to ask this to Jason and also to Mitu, who spent some time at the exhibition. Sorry, Leigh, this sort of revolves around the actual installation. And I'm going to take you off of seeing the audience because it's just glitchy when we just might have lost you.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
No, that's
good.
okay. I don't need to see. It's fine.
Okay. So I'm curious, I spent some time talking about an 80s arcade vibe or something like that, but I'm curious, to hear Jason, your reaction, and Mitu, your reaction to how sort of some of the visual elements of Jason's work you felt like succeeded or perhaps failed in a very, very new kind of visual environment rather than sitting, at a laptop and playing the game on a sort of one-to-one experience.
I think, so you specifically how it worked within the context of the installation here?
Yeah.
I think, I think it worked well. I think, allowing for a space where you're experiencing this work in context, because one of the things I love about the exhibition is just how much material Jason's provided for sort of his working process, and I think just being able to play a game like that in context. And I think the nice thing is about the space is it's quite big, it doesn't feel crowded, so you still get to have those opportunities to just get lost and have these quiet, self-reflective moments of playing his games. So yeah, I think this format works really well.
We've talked about this a little bit, but I guess I would just be curious, to hear your, it must be sort of strange to see these things as spatial configurations rather than just kind of abstracted screen configurations.
Well, the whole thing is strange. This happened to me, right?
Yeah.
I've had family members all the time asking, how did this happen to you?
Yeah.
This is something that
the short answer is I read a random Wired magazine profile in 2009 and got interested in your work. But
the idea of picking out this one element as being particularly surreal. I think the whole thing is surreal, and so I don't know. It's amazing to see Primrose up on this wall. It's and so. And Mike and I worked, together talking about how these things are going to be presented, talking about which games are going to be featured in these larger build-outs, trying to figure out 4 games that kind of work well together, and how they're going to be laid out spatially, and the fact that there's this very visually cool element of Primrose that we can actually trim out using these barn doors on the projector, so that we just have this sort of more austere grid without the other graphical user interface elements, and the fact that the game, because the user interface elements are sort of separate from the grid, that can be done very easily, and so people walking down on the floor who aren't playing the game don't need to see the extra user interface that's sort of more visually distracting as just sort of a wall display. So this kind of stuff, we definitely thought through it, worked through it. I didn't come here and I was not shocked. I saw architectural sketches and other things along the way, and so I think if we think about the presentation of Cordial Minuet, this example of having to go through these kind of narrow doorways to fit down inside this darkened chamber to play this thing against another person. I think that kind of fits with the way the game is, with themes of the game and so on. It's sort of a perfect way to kind of build that out in this kind of you look down from the balcony, there's this hulking thing down there, which is this, what is that? What's in there? Oh yeah, that's the occult gambling booth.
Yeah, no, I think the, design is design to an extent, right? And I think it's really interesting seeing seeing the space designed around this kind of exhibit of Jason's games. And also the thing to add to that, I mean, games aren't just a purely cerebral thing. Like, play has always been physical to some extent, right? Like, we interact with our hands, with our fingers at the very least, but, you know, like, we forget, like, how physical play is, like, all play, video games and everything else. And I think just bringing that sense of physicality back into games and foregrounding some of that, I think is really important.
I think it's super interesting. It's been funny seeing how a game like Inside a Starfilled Sky, which has a controller for where the character moves and then another controller for where the character is aiming. I've seen that played over and over again. It's a duet. So there's like a physical interaction between a solo player game that winds up being played by two players at the same time.
I have a question about kind of, the visuals and all kind of video games and this connection. Like, art historically, I've like seen conversations about video games related to minimalism, and it was even mentioned here, expressionism, cubism. This like connections to like this visual language that had been going on throughout history. I'm wondering if artists or critics, video game artists in particular, are thinking about the visual culture of time and how it would connect to minimalist art or something like a painter like Mondrian and like breaking up space and time. Is that a concern, or is that something that is brought up?
I feel like one of the problems with, I would love for those conversations to happen. I feel like often one of the problems with video games, video games culture is we forget the rest of art history. Like, sometimes there's this sort of attitude.
Can't even remember our own history. Like, games have about a 5-year memory, and then we have to repeat the same sort of cultural dialogue among ourselves.
Yeah, precisely. And I mean, let alone remembering the rest of art history and its lessons. So I think as games creators, we can do better at engaging with what's been proven before and done before, rather than thinking, oh, hey, this is this new thing I just invented. Well, actually, no. It's like, it's very much rooted in the history of art. So.
But go ahead.
No,
right,
please. Yeah.
So I guess a lot of people see pixel art as being like video game art, and with Jason's work, it's trying to see what video games can be, and it kind of breaking out of the mold. And so I was hoping you could talk about the tension between having this thing look and sound like a traditional video game, but then having it explore ideas that are not so common in games.
I personally always thought that tension served Jason's work really well, because if there's something that makes art interesting, it's doing something unexpected with something familiar. And I think that's one of the strengths of his work, that you may go in expecting a certain, if you're not acquainted with games, you may go into one of his games expecting a certain thing, and maybe then get something surprising out of it. And then if you are acquainted with games, you have a way that, like, all media has a vocabulary, and if you're acquainted with games, you're conversant in that vocabulary, and having that vocabulary subverted in some way is interesting. So I think all art can take something familiar and subvert it. So why not with games? I think that's one of the contrasts that's interesting about Jason's work, is that a lot of them are pixel art video games, but none of them are just like, wow, arcade. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it seems like a conscious choice on Jason's part. As Leigh said, it's about subverting what the player knows, and also providing like a context for people who only have a certain idea of video games to be able to engage with something. I think it's as Leigh said, it serves Jason's work really well, and I think because Jason was doing things like Passage like so long ago, there was then after that, and sort of in the sort of subsequent years, that sort of trend of sort of 2D platformers about feelings, right?
Yeah, that actually became maybe too much of a thing.
Too much of a thing, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and I feel like
conversation half of mechanics.
And I feel like and that's kind of like a trend which we're now sort of getting over, and I feel like now we're moving into the era of, I guess it's like endless runners about feelings is the next trend I've noticed. So I feel like there's this sort of trend in video games of like taking like a well-known, an established context and then going, okay, can we say something meaningful with this? Or,
And video games as a medium are so young that I think that when we do find something that is innovative or that is like legible through an artistic lens, we get really excited about it and we repeat it a lot and a lot until we've kind of figured it out back to front before trying something else.
Jason, can I ask a very straightforward, like, visual design question? How did it feel as a departure to have a style in Cordial Minuet as like a hand-painted kind of brushy, like visual vocabulary that was, in some ways, like to me, having like spent some time with your work, like the biggest almost visual departure that you make in the history of your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of silly, actually. I mean, the reasons for stuff like that, it's like, I made like all these games that had, very austere visuals on purpose for a while, and then I had like people like my friend Frank Lance here, who's on the panel later, I think, saying, dude, just hire an artist. Hire an artist. That's what you do. You design the game and then you hire an artist. Frank impression. I don't know. Anyway. So anyway, I was like, but I can actually draw, sort of. And so I was like, I guess I felt like with that, I always wanted my games to have art that felt at home on the computer. And so up until the point of Cordial Minuet, I said, like, I don't want to make a game that looks like a chalk drawing or like an oil painting or like a watercolor thing. In part because I always felt like the games that looked like that had these like interactive digital elements to them that were incongruous with the fact that it looks like a physical object, right? This looks like a crayon drawing, but all of a sudden a piece of the crayon drawing can kind of like roll, right? And so with Cordial Minuet, I was like, okay, I want to make something that's more visually appealing, mostly for commercial reasons. Right? Like I want to make something that lots of people will say, this isn't just another retro pixel game and pan it that way. People will say like, ooh, there's something visually alluring about this. There's something kind of, beautiful about this, or like, I want to, like, this screen looks pretty or something, right? To people who don't think pixel art looks pretty, I guess. I mean, I think pixel art looks pretty, but some people don't, right? Or most people don't. Or most people just sort of pigeonhole it for that reason. At the same time, I was very careful with Cordial Minuet to keep all of the digital interactive elements that are sort of incongruous with the physical object separate from the physical object that's at the center of the screen. So while ink is added to the page and painted on, it's never magically removed. It doesn't flicker in and out, it doesn't pop in and out. The highlights that show you possible rows and things are always off the sides. The little sliders look like they're not physical objects, they look digital. So like you can see, like I'm still working with this idea of like, hey, I've got this thing in the center that looks like a piece of like medieval parchment, but there's never like a button made out of medieval parchment that you put on, right? So I guess that's kind of where I'm sort of still trying to stick to my guns about this. Like we don't want to have buttons that look like carved stone that all of a sudden
that are buttons.
Click, right?
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
So we were talking about pixel art and it's kind of like giving gamers what they expect and then subverting that in Jason's games. But my question is about the exhibition and if the exhibition has changed the way of people viewing the exhibition, about how they feel about pixel art, how they feel about video games in general, as an art form. So I was just wondering if you've had any kind of response about how this exhibition has changed the view of games.
For sure. We were delighted to have a little write-up in the New York Times, and the headline was something like, an exhibition that finally proves video games can be art.
Whoever favorite headline.
Oh my God.
She made a great tweet about it.
The joke that I've started telling about this is like this conversation of like, can video games be art? It's like an intellectual version of like, is the hot dog
Can I hang up?
Yeah. We're about to try to move on from this, but I will say that from my perspective as a curator, one of the things that I wanted very, very much to take seriously Jason's work, and I feel like this conversation of are video games art is a way of asking, do video games are there kinds of video games that are worthy of this very, very serious, deep consideration, like a Picasso? Yes, totally. I hope this exhibition really helped advance that ball. But I also wanted to do a project as a museum curator about a piece of new media culture, whatever it was, that didn't think of itself as art, that didn't envision itself ending up in a gallery, a museum, or whatever, because that's what museums used to do. They used to show things that weren't designed to be shown in museums, and I wanted to try to return to that like very, very old way of sort of like curatorial practice.
Can I add to that, Mike?
Yes.
So I manage our tour program here at the Davis, and we've had a lot of third grade groups coming in recently that want to see Jason's exhibition, but we can't fit them all in the show at the same time, or else it would be a little bit chaotic. So we've been doing a tour about materials in art, and we started by looking at a Monet painting, by looking at a marble sculpture, and then we go downstairs and we look at Jason's work, and I can tell you that you now have a generation of kids that are coming up and totally believing that video games are art, and have been really into it. So it's been fun to see them make those connections between the more traditional fine arts in the museum and seeing the video games on view.
There you go. Thank you all very much. I want to give you guys a quick 10-minute break to use the restroom, get a drink of water, do whatever, before we get started with our second panel on game mechanics. So thank you all very much. Thank our speakers.